is start. If we save it, they'll be aligned to the start or the left side. If we change this to end, now they will be aligned to the end or the right side. We can also change this to center to put all of our elements in the center. So that's how we control how these elements are positioned horizontally. We're going to go through another example here. We're going to copy this whole flexbox and we're going to create another one below it. Let's copy it and paste it. And for this one, we're going to set a special value of space dash between. So what space between does is that it spreads out our elements evenly across this horizontal space. And it makes sure that there's equal amount of space between each element. So this is really useful if we go back to our header to spread out these 4 icons evenly. Now the last example we're going to go through for Flexbox is how to align elements vertically. So let's copy this again and create another Flexbox. So let's copy this, paste it down here. And for this one, we're going to set another Flexbox property called align-items. So this determines how these elements are aligned vertically. The default value is stretch, which you can see here. The elements are stretching to fill up the vertical space. But we also have some options. We can align them to the start, so they will no longer stretch to the vertical space. They will just take up as much vertical space as they need to, and they will be placed at the top. Or we can put them at the end, which will place them at the bottom of the container. And we can put them in the center, which will place them vertically centered. If we look at our final project again, you'll notice that all of these things in the header are vertically centered. So now we learned all these skills that we need and we're ready to build the header for our project. Let's go to the code for our project we were working on, which was youtube.html, and make sure you have this open in your browser. I'm going to resize the window here and also the code editor so that it's easier to see what's going on as we code. We're first going to create an element at the top to represent our header. So let's scroll down, and currently all we have is this input. So we're going to create a new div and we're going to give it a class of header. So this div is going to represent the header in the final project. And now let's put our search bar into our new header. So we'll cut this and paste it in here. Next, if we look at our final project, the header has 3 sections. We have a section on the left, a middle section with the search bar, and the right section here with some icons. So we're going to simplify this by first creating these 3 sections and then aligning them, and then filling out these sections with the appropriate elements. So let's go back down here, and we're going to create 3 sections. So we'll just use 3 divs here. So let's call this class equals left dash section. We'll create another div. We'll call it class equals middle dash section. We'll create another div and we'll give it a class of right dash section. And we'll put the search bar into the middle section right here. And now let's style this div so that we have roughly the same dimensions. So before we do that, you'll notice that we already have a lot of CSS code in this file. And the best practice is actually to put the CSS in a separate file. So before we write even more CSS, let's go ahead and put this into its own CSS file. So we're actually going to have multiple CSS files. One file for styles of the video preview, and another for every style of the header. So let's actually create a new folder first to organize all of our different files of CSS. So we'll create a new folder and let's just call this styles. Inside, we're going to create 2 CSS files. The first one is going to be called video.css, And the second is going to be header.css. So first we're going to go into our youtube.html. We're going to move all of this into the video.css file. So let's move this into here. Now all these styles for these videos are separated into their own file. Now if I scroll up to the top here, you'll notice we also have some styles for the header. So this actually belongs in the header. And we're going to move this into our header.css file. So we're grouping related styles together to make it easier to read. Now for the top of this file again, we have this code that targets all paragraphs on the page. So this is not actually specific to our videos. So I'm actually going to create another file called general.css. And that's going to contain all the general CSS code like this, where we target all paragraph elements on the page. So move this piece of code into general. So just like that, we have 3 CSS files, and they're all very focused on one part of our web page. So this is generally what we want to do. We want to organize our code and separate them into different files depending on what the code does. Next, we're going to go into our HTML file, and we can remove this, and let's save it. But now you can see that all of these styles that we had are gone. So we need to link them back into our HTML. To do that, we're going to create a link element. We'll have an attribute of rel, which tells it what we're linking. So we're linking a style sheet, and we also tell it what file we're linking with href. So here, beside our HTML file, we have a styles folder. So we're going to first link the styles folder, and then we're going to type a slash to go into it and link general.css. And now we're going to link our other 2 CSS files. So to do that, we just need to copy and paste this. And then we're going to link header.css. And for the third one, we're going to link video.css. And if we save it, we linked all of our code in 3 separate files, and we're back to where we were. Next, let's focus on our header styles and create our header. We're going to go into this file, and we actually don't need this display block anymore. So we use this to put the search bar on a separate line, but now the search bar is inside a bunch of divs. So the divs will create that separate line for us. Now, the one other thing that we had to do is that notice that there is some spacing on the left side, on the right side, and at the top. So by default, if we right click and inspect, and we look at the body, so the body element has 8 pixels of margin on every side by default. Now to get a more precise design, we actually want to set this to 0. So we're going to reset these default styles. So we'll go into our CSS code, and we're going to go into the general file. And we're going to target the body, and we're going to get rid of all margins. An easier way to do this is to set the margin property and set it to 0. So this will set all margins in all directions to 0. Let's save it. And now our elements are right up to the edge of the page. Next, we're going to work on our header. So I'm actually going to make this wider so that we can have both of these files on each side. So we're going to have the HTML on the left and the CSS on the right. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to add a height to this header so that it looks like our design here. So let's go into our header CSS file. And remember, we set a class of header. So we'll target that using .header. And we'll set a height of maybe 40 pixels. Okay, so let's compare that to our design. Looks like our design is a lot taller. Let's change it to maybe 55 pixels. Let's compare that. So I'm just comparing this to the bottom edge of here. And that looks pretty good. So next, we're going to position these 3 sections: the left section, the middle section, and the right section. So in our code, we can't actually see the sections right now because they don't have any content in them. Let's just call this the left section, and then add the text here as well, the right section. Save it. And now we have these three. However, you'll notice that they're being aligned vertically. And that's because divs by default are display block. And we haven't made this into a flexbox yet. So to create a horizontal layout, we're going to turn our header container here into a flexbox. We're going to set the display to flex. And we're also going to set the flex-direction to row to lay them out horizontally. So let's save. And now our sections only take up as much space as we need to, as we saw in our examples. Next, let's give these a background color so it's easier to see them. So for the left section, we're going to target it, and we'll set a background dash color of light blue. And for the middle section, we'll set a background color of light pink. And for the right section, we're going to set a background color of light blue. Right section, background color of light blue. So now how do we create this layout? So let's analyze it a little bit. If we resize the page, notice that this middle section is also resizing. So to achieve this, we're going to use a property called flex. So if you recall in our examples, flex takes up the remaining amount of space. So if I look at the header in our final project, when I resize, this right section is not changing its width, and neither is the left section. So these will have a predefined width, and then this will be flex, because as you can see, it's growing as the page is being resized. So that's an example of how to analyze these layouts. Don't worry, you'll get better with more practice. For now, we're going to do this example together. On the left section, we're going to set a fixed width. Let's set this to maybe 200 pixels. Let's see how that looks. We'll compare it to our design. So it's actually a little too much. I want it to end right here after the YouTube logo. So we're going to go back and let's change this to 150 pixels. And let's compare it. So that looks pretty close. For this middle section, we want it to stretch. So remember, the property to do that is called flex1. So now the middle section is stretching. And for the right section, we also want a fixed width. So let's compare it. We want it to be somewhere here. Let's try setting a width of 200 pixels. And then let's compare these two. Okay, so I think this is pretty close to the structure that we have here. So what we're doing is we're just simplifying the structure into the bigger picture, and then we'll go in and add these smaller details. Now we're going to set some spacing on the left and the right side of this middle section. So remember, to do that, we're going to set our margins. So on the left side, let's set a margin dash left of maybe 30 pixels. Save it, and let's compare. So it's definitely more than 30 pixels. Let's change it to maybe 70 pixels. Save it and compare. So this compared to this, I think that's close enough. So now for the right section, we're also going to add a little bit of space. So if we look at our design, so it's less space than we have here. So we're going to add a margin to the right of the middle section. And we'll set it to maybe 30 pixels. Save it. And that looks pretty close to what we have here. Maybe 35 pixels. Okay. So now if we resize our page, you'll notice that the middle section is growing and shrinking with the page, and the right and left are staying the same width, which is exactly what we have here. So there's one other detail we're going to copy for this middle section. Notice that if I resize the browser and make it wider, at some point the middle section stops growing. So at roughly this point, the middle section will stop growing if the browser gets wider. And it just keeps the same width and is centered horizontally. We're going to learn how to do that. Let's go back into our project, and we're going to limit the width of this middle section first. So we'll go into our code, and the property to do that is called max-width. And let's set it to 300 pixels. So this property says the width can be less than 300 pixels, but as soon as it grows to be over 300 pixels, we're going to limit it to 300. So that's what we see here. Now when we resize the browser to be less than 300 pixels, notice that it's shrinking and growing again. But when the browser gets wider, it's limited to 300 pixels because of this line of code. Next, we want to distribute these three sections evenly across our horizontal space. So just like what we have here. Now remember to do that in Flexbox. We have an example here. If we go back into our code and go into our Flexbox practice file, we can find that example in our code. And remember that we achieved this using a property called justify content space between. And we set this property on our Flexbox container. And that's what we're going to do for our project right now. So we're going to go up to our Flexbox container. Let's go back to our youtube.html. And to spread these out evenly across the entire horizontal space, we're going to set justify-content space-between. Let's save it. And now they take up the entire space. So if we compare this to our design, we'll notice that the middle section is still a little bit too narrow compared to our design. So let's increase the max width here. So let's increase it to 400 pixels. See how that looks. Okay, so it's still bigger. Let's increase it to 500 pixels. See how that looks. Okay, so I think that looks close enough to our design. So this middle section in pink is roughly equal to this middle section over here. So that's the end of this lesson. We learned about Flexbox and we used it to create the layout for our header. So in this situation, we were mostly focused on our content size. We wanted to make sure the middle section had a max width and at least some space in between. So that's why we used a Flexbox, because we were focused on our content size first, and then the layout doesn't matter as much. We just use a Flexbox to spread out our content evenly across the horizontal space. So when we focus on content size first, we use a Flexbox. When we want to create a grid, we use grid. And for most other situations, for example, this horizontal layout that we created in the nested layouts technique, we can use either grid or Flexbox. In most situations, they do the same thing. So here are some exercises that you can practice using Flexbox to get yourself more familiar with how it works. And now that we have the general layout, we're going to finish up the rest of the header. Before we do that, we're going to download all of these icons and images that you see here. To do that, we're going to right-click, inspect, and then click this in the top left, and then click the icon we want to download, and then we can find the URL down here. I'm going to hover over it, and then click this link to open in a new tab, and then save it with Control S. So I'm going to save this in the folder that contains our code, which is this one. So I'm going to save it. And then in our code editor, we should see this icon. So we can collapse this by pressing that. And then now we have our icon right here called the hamburger menu. Now looking at our header, we have a lot of icons to download. So let's organize them using a folder. We're going to create a new folder and let's call this icons. Now we're going to put the icon we downloaded into that folder. So this one right here into this folder. And now we're going to do the same steps to download all of these other icons and this image that we see here. So we're going to do the same steps, click the top left, and then click the icon we want to download, and we can find the link here. I'm going to fast forward the video here because it's just a bunch of repetitive steps, and we'll continue after we downloaded all the icons. So when you get to the notification icon, don't worry about this notification number here. We're going to learn how to do that in the next section. And for this channel profile picture, when I download it, I'm actually going to save it in a different folder from the other icons. So if I download this here and save it, I'm going to put this in the channel pictures folder instead of the icons folder, because technically it's a channel picture. So once we have all of that downloaded, let's check in our code editor, and we should see all of the icons that we need for the header inside the icons folder, as well as the channel profile picture on the right in the channel pictures folder. And now we're ready to complete our header in our current project. So in our left section, we have this, which is called a hamburger menu and the YouTube logo. So in our HTML, in this file, in our left section, we're going to have an image, and we're going to tell it what to load. So loading an SVG is the same thing as any other image. We're going to go into the icons folder, and we're going to load the hamburger menu.svg. And then we're also going to load the YouTube logo, which is right here. So YouTube logo.svg. Save that and look at our web page and refresh. So the images are loaded, but they're way too big. Let's make them smaller. We're going to set a class so that we can target them with CSS. So hamburger-menu. And for this one, let's set a class of YouTube-logo. And now in our CSS, let's go in here and target the hamburger menu class. And let's set the height to something like 20 pixels. And same thing for the YouTube logo. We'll set the height to 20 pixels. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, if we look at our design, we'll notice that these images are actually aligned vertically in the center. So in our Flexbox practice file, we learned how to do this. If we look at our code again, if we look at our Flexbox code, we scroll all the way down to the last example. We did this using align items center. So that aligns them vertically in the center like this. We'll go back to our header CSS and just have this as a reference. So for our left section, we're going to set align-items:center. However, you'll notice that it didn't do anything. And that's because if we look at our HTML, the header is a flexbox, but this left section here is still a regular div. It's an element inside the flexbox, but this itself is not a flexbox, so align items doesn't do anything. Now to fix this, we can actually turn the left section into a flexbox using display flex. And if we save it, now the left section is a flexbox, so align items will align it vertically in the center. So Flexbox doesn't actually go down 2 layers. It only affects elements on the first layer, like this div and this div. If we go down another level, like here, Flexbox doesn't affect it. That's why we have to turn this into a Flexbox as well in order to use properties like align items center. So this situation of putting a Flexbox inside another Flexbox is totally valid if we want to target another level of elements like this. Let's go into our design and compare it. And you can see that for our design, there is some spacing on the left and the right of the hamburger menu. So we can create that right now using margin-left of 20 pixels and margin-right of 20 pixels. So we'll add 20 pixels on both of these sides. So if I go back and forth, you'll notice that this icon is a little bit bigger than our project. So we can actually adjust our height here to make our icon a little bit bigger. We can maybe set this to 24. And let's compare it. Okay, so that looks pretty close. So now I notice that this icon is a little bit to the right of our website, which is here. So you notice that it's a little bit to the right. We need to add more spacing. So let's add margin left of maybe 24 pixels. Save it. Now if we compare the two, so that looks pretty much close to what we need. And the YouTube logo is also in the same place. So that's a bonus for us. So now it looks like the left section is pretty much done in our project. And we can get rid of this background color that we were practicing with. First, we're actually going to remove the width. So this width of 150 pixels is forcing the left section to only end up here. However, if we remove this, the left section will stretch to contain all of its content. So if we save it, you can see that it stretches. Now we can remove the background color. And that's done. Next, we're going to work on this middle section. So for this middle section in our design, we have an icon here, a button here, and if we resize, you'll notice that the search box also resizes. So this search box is going to grow with the rest of the page. So we already learned how to do that. As a reminder, it's flex 1. So first, let's go in and create these two buttons first, because that's the easy part. Let's go into our code. In the middle section here, after the search bar, we're going to create two buttons. So let's create one button here and another button down here. So inside this first button, we're going to have this search icon. So if we go into our icons folder, it's this icon here, search.svg. So we can create an image element, source, and icons/search.svg. In the second button, we're going to have our voice search icon, which is this one. And we're going to create another image element, and we're going to load icons/voice search icon. Now let's save it and see how that looks. Okay, so that didn't work out very well. Probably because if you remember when we loaded this icon here, it was super big. So the two icons we loaded are probably super big, and we only see the top left corner, which is empty. So first, let's make our icon smaller and make our buttons a little bigger. Let's go into our HTML. We're going to add some classes so that we can target it with CSS. So class, let's call this the search-button. And let's call this one the voice-search-button. So we're going to go to the middle section here. We're going to target the search button first. Let's set the height to something like 40 pixels and set the width to something like 60 pixels. And for the voice search button, if we look at our design, it's pretty much round. So let's target voice search button. Let's set a height of 40 pixels. And we'll set the width to 40 pixels as well. So let's save it. Okay, so that looks super weird, but we're going to fix this right now. So remember that we want to align these in the center vertically, just like this. To do that, our middle section is also going to be a flex box. And then we can use the align items property that we use for the left section. So let's make this middle section a flex box. And we're going to set display to flex. And we're going to set align -items to center, just like our left section. So now if we save, you'll see that everything is aligned to the center, and now it's ready for us to style. So there is one thing that I left out, which is flex direction row. So this tells a flexbox to lay out our content horizontally, and this is actually the default value, so we don't actually need it. I put it here just for our practice code. But for our header, we can be safe actually leaving that line out and just having display flex and align item center. So now that the layout is good, we're going to go back to our tried and true method of styling this one by one with CSS. The first thing I'm going to adjust is this search bar. So notice that it stretches to fill up the content when we resize the page. To do that, we're going to go into our code. We're going to target the search bar, so .search-bar right here. And remember to stretch it to take up the remaining space. We're going to set flex 1 and save. Now let's make the search box similar to the design. So I'm actually going to move this here side by side so that it's easier to copy from. So I'll go back into my code, and the first thing I'll adjust is the height. So let's set a height of 40 pixels. Okay, that looks a little too much. Let's set the height to 36. See how that looks. So I think it's still a little too much. Let's set it to 34. And that looks pretty good to me. Next, let's adjust this placeholder text. So to adjust the placeholder, we actually need another sort of pseudo class. So we're going to type .searchbar to target the search bar, and then we're going to type : placeholder. So this is how you target the placeholder on an input element like this. So first, let's set the font-family to the one we're using for this page. If we go to general.css, we're using Roboto, Arial. So we're going to set that to Roboto, Arial. Save it. So the font changed a little bit. We're going to change the font size to make it bigger. So font-size to 16 pixels, let's say. Okay, I think that looks a little bigger. And then next, we notice that on the inside of this input, we have a little bit of space, while we don't have that much space here. So we're going to set some padding on the left of our search bar. So let's set the padding -left to 12 pixels. Save it. Okay, that looks okay. Let's actually set it to 10 pixels. And then when we start typing into the search bar, notice that the font is bigger, but for here, we still have the small font. So we can set the font size to 16 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so that looks pretty close to what we have. And next, I'm going to change the border. So I'll set the border-width to 1 pixels. The border style, we want it to be solid. And finally, I'm going to set a border-color of gray. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so I can't really tell the color because of the background. We're going to remove this light pink background because we don't need it anymore. And that looks a little too dark, so I'm going to pick something lighter. Maybe something like this. Save. And I think that's close enough to that. Next, let's adjust the height again, because when we set the border, it actually made it a little bit smaller. So we'll set the height to 36. And now it aligns with the buttons. And I'm also going to create rounded corners. So that property is border-radius. Let's set it to 2 pixels. Now the last style we're going to adjust for this is the shadow. So if we zoom into this search box, there's actually a little bit of shadow in the inside, while our search box does not have that. So we'll go back into our code, and we're going to add a shadow. We're going to use this from one of the very early lessons, box-shadow. And if we want a shadow on the inside of the element instead of the outside, we just need to set inset at the beginning. So this will put this box shadow in the inside. Now we have our usual values, which is the horizontal position. So let's set it to 1 pixels. So it's going to be moved 1 pixels to the right, and the vertical position, let's set it to 2 pixels. The shadow will be moved 2 pixels to the bottom. Let's set a blur of maybe 5 pixels. And we'll set the shadow color to RGBA 000, which is black, and then transparency set to only 0.15 to get a very transparent black. So let's save this. So that's way too much. Let's actually reduce the blur to 3 pixels maybe, and then change this to 0.05. So we're doing a lot of trial and error with CSS, which is normal. Okay, so I think this looks pretty close to our design. I think it looks close enough. For now, we're going to move on and style the buttons. So first, let's resize this icon inside the button. So let's give this a class of search-icon. Save it. And then in here, in the .search icon, we're going to make it a little smaller. So let's set the height to 20 pixels. See how that looks? Okay, so that looks too small. I'm going to try 25 pixels. All right, so that size looks pretty similar. Now you notice that this one is vertically aligned while ours is not. So we can either turn the search button into a flex box, or we can just do a simpler solution. We're going to add some spacing to the top of this icon to push it down. So margin dash top of maybe 4 pixels to push that down just a little bit. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. Let's finish off this button. We're going to set a background color of gray, and then I'm going to adjust it to match that. So I'm going to pick something like this, maybe 240, and then save it. That looks pretty good, but now our borders are messed up. So we're going to set the border width of 1 pixel, border dash style of solid color, and border color is going to be the same as our text box. So we can go up here and just copy that. And right there. Save it. And there we go. That looks pretty close right now. So now we want to move this button into this input element a little bit, like you see here, so that we only have one edge. To do that, here's a little trick. We can set some spacing on the left, so margin left, except this time we're going to add negative spacing. So we're going to add -1 spacing. Normal margin adds space and it pushes the element. Negative margin subtracts space and pulls the element to that side. So margin left of a negative number will pull it to the left. So let's pull it to the left by 1 pixel, save it, and that looks really good. Now we're going to make our button a little bit longer. Let's change it to 66. Finally, we're going to style this voice search icon. First, we notice that there's a little bit of space between these two. So let's set a margin on the right side of the button. So this time it's normal margin. Margin right of maybe 8 pixels. I think that looks pretty close. I'm actually going to set it to 10. Okay. And then for this button, I'm first going to make it round. So let's go into the styles of this button. And to make it round, we just have to make the corners as round as possible. Let's set the border radius, and I'm going to set it to 20 pixels. So a trick here is that if you set this to half the width of the height, it will make it round. So let's save this, and now we have a round button, but we have a weird border. Let's actually get rid of it because it's not in our design. So border and none to get rid of the border. So it's looking really close. Our icon is a little bit bigger than this one. So we're going to target it in here. Class equals voice dash search dash icon. And then in our CSS, we'll target that. So voice dash search dash icon. So for this, let's set a height of maybe 20 pixels. See how that looks? It's a little bit small. Let's increase it to 24. I think that looks pretty good. And next we're going to try to vertically align it. We're going to add a little bit of margin on the top to push it down. So margin dash top and 4 pixels. Okay, that looks pretty good. The last thing is to change the background color. So we're going to change the background color to, let's say, gray, and then I'll pick another color. So this time let's pick maybe 245. And then save. Oh, so I accidentally put it on the icon. We actually want to put this on the entire button. So I'm going to cut and paste this onto the button styles. Let's save. And I think that looks pretty close. So this color is a little bit off from this, but I think it's okay if we look at the bigger picture. So now we've completed the middle section, and you can compare it here to here. So we're looking really good so far. Next, we're going to finish the right section. So I'm going to put them side by side again, so it's easier for us to copy. So the right section has 3 icons and an image. So we're going to add them to our HTML first. So let's go into the right section here. And we're going to create an image, and we're going to load this, which is the upload icon. So icons slash upload.svg. And then we'll add another one. So image. And this one is going to be icons slash, this one is called YouTube apps.svg. And then the last one is the notification icon, which is here. So image element, and we're going to load icons slash notifications.svg. And finally, we're going to create another image, and we're going to load this channel profile picture. So source, and this one is located in a different folder. It's in the channel pictures folder, and it's called mychannel.jpg. So let's save it, refresh, and again, our SVGs are massive. So let's go ahead and resize them in our CSS. So first, let's add classes to all of these images. So we're going to set this one to upload-icon. So upload-icon. The next one is going to be YouTube apps icon. So class equals YouTube-apps-icon. Next one we'll do notifications-icon. So class equals notifications-icon. And lastly, we're going to name this a little bit different. Let's give it a class, and let's call this one current-user-picture. So it's a little more clear that this is different. And we can target it with CSS. So let's go down into the right section here, and we'll scroll up, and we'll first resize the icons. So let's resize the upload icon. Let's set a height of 24 pixels. And then we'll do the YouTube-apps icon. Let's set a height of 24 pixels. And then the notifications icon, which is right here, icon. Let's set a height of this, 24 pixels again. And the current user picture. So notice it's a little bit taller. Let's target that, current-user-picture. And we're going to set a height of 32 pixels to make it a little bit taller. So let's save it. And now we have the icons we're going to use. Again, we want to align these vertically in the center. Remember to do that, we're going to scroll up to our middle section, which is all the way up here. We first have to turn this container into a flexbox, and then we can use align items center. So inside our HTML, we have to turn this into a flexbox. Let's scroll down to the right section styles here. We're going to turn this display : flex. And then we're going to set align -items : center to align them vertically. Let's save it. Okay. Next, we want to distribute them evenly across the horizontal space. And remember from our practice code, that one's called justify-content space-between. Let's save it. And now these icons are spaced evenly across the space. So it looks like they're a little bit too far apart from each other. We can adjust that by adjusting the width. So let's decrease the width to bring everything closer together to match our design. And I actually think this, like all the icons, look good enough. The only last thing we're going to change is this picture here. So notice it's still a square. We want to make it a circle. So as a review, we're going to use border radius to make it a circle. So let's set it to border-radius. And the trick we learned is half of this will make it round. So 16 pixels. Save it. And now we have a round channel profile picture. Lastly, we're pretty much done with this, so we can get rid of the blue background color. So we'll scroll up and get rid of this. Now, I actually noticed that we have spacing to the right here in our design. So that's one thing I missed. So let's add that right now. So we're going to add margin right to this section of maybe 24 pixels. Save it. And I think that's a little too much. I can't really tell. Let's set it to 20 just to be safe. Okay, so I'm happy with how this looks. All right, so that's basically the content in our header. If we look at it right now, it looks really professional. So I know that while we were working on it, it looked a little bit weird, it looked unfinished, but you just got to trust the process. And at the end, we have a really professional result that looks like our design. Now, there's going to be one last case I'm going to show you. And this is a weird behavior of Flexbox. So if I resize my browser and I make it smaller, notice that these icons start to get closer to each other. So this happens because Flexbox is flexible. When we start not having enough space, it'll start shrinking the items inside. But if we look at our final project and we shrink the browser, notice that this doesn't shrink. And we sort of forced only the search bar to shrink. So let's go back into our project and into our code. And Flexbox has a special property to prevent certain items from shrinking. So we're going to scroll down to the right section here. And to prevent the right section from shrinking, we're just going to set this property. Flex-shrink:0. So this means that no matter what happens, we're going to keep this width and we're not going to shrink. So 0 means don't shrink. If we save it, now you're going to see that it doesn't shrink. But now when we resize it, notice that the search bar doesn't actually shrink all the way like our design. So the way to achieve this is to go into our HTML, and then we're going to go into our search bar, which is right here. So normally search bars have a default width, and we can't really see that because we set flex to 1. So it's sort of growing with the page, but as soon as it hits that default width, it's not going to go down anymore. So to remove that default width, we can just set width to 0. We save it, and now you can see that the search box will start shrinking as much as possible. So to recap, we set flex shrink of 0 to this right section so it doesn't shrink, and then we set a width of 0 to the search bar so that it does shrink. Here are some exercises to get yourself familiar with using Flexbox to create flexible layouts. Now we're going to learn the last major skill that we need to finish off our project. We're going to learn CSS position. So position helps us do things like keep the header at the top of the page while we scroll. It also helps us keep the sidebar at the top of the page. And lastly, whenever we see an element on top of another element, that's using CSS position. For example, here the video time is on top of the thumbnail. The notification number is on top of the icon. And when I hover over this, we have a tooltip on top of the page. So CSS position adds another dimension to our page. So just like the previous lessons, we're going to create a new HTML file just to practice position. I'm going to go into my code editor. We're going to create a new file, and let's put it right here beside the other ones. New file, let's call this position.html. Now, as always, we're going to start with the HTML structure. So we're going to have doc type at the top, and then an HTML element. Inside, we have a head element, and then we have a body element. Now we can right click and open with Live Server, and we're ready to begin. So first, let's add a title so that we know what this HTML file is for. Let's call this position practice. Save it, and then it should show up here. We're going to start in the body again, and we're going to create two divs. Let's call this div 1 and another div 2. And I'm just going to resize this a little bit so we can see it side by side. So just like before, we're going to use inline styles so that our CSS is close to our HTML code. I'm going to set a style, and then we're going to set this one to background-color and light blue. And we're going to set the height and the width to 200 pixels. So height 200 pixels and width 200 pixels. Next, we're going to set the second div to be the same size, but with background color light pink. So again, we set a style, and then we set a background dash color of light pink, height of 200 pixels, and width of 200 pixels. So CSS position is just the position property. So let's go into our first div, and we're going to set the position property to static, and then save. So position static is the default position. It's the same thing as if you don't have this line at all. Now we're going to learn a second position property that allows us to stick an element to the top of the page like this while we scroll. And that is called position fixed. So we're going to create a new element at the top here. And let's call this our header. So we're going to learn how to create something that works like this. So for this div, we're going to set a style of background color, black, and a text color of white. And now we're going to learn how to stick this to the top of the page. So first of all, we need to be able to scroll. And right now, I don't have enough content to make the page scroll. So what I'll do is we'll go to the body here. I'm going to set a style. And then inside the body, we're going to set a style of height and something really big, like 3000 pixels. So we just need to make sure that we're able to scroll this page. Next, we're going to make this header stick at the top. To do that, we're going to use the position property. And this time, we're going to set a position of fixed. Now, when I save it and I start scrolling, notice how the header element is sticking to the page when I scroll. So that's how we make it stick. So the first thing to note is that when we set position fixed like this, it doesn't take up space on the page anymore. So before we had this, and if I save it, so notice that it takes up the top of the page, and then these two divs appear below this header. But when we add position fixed, it no longer takes up that space at the top of the page, because it's sort of floating above the page now. So that's one way to think about it. So the position property has 4 special properties we can use to move this element around. The first one is called top. The way that top works is that we can set a pixel measurement. For example, if we set 0 pixels, this is going to make the top of our element 0 pixels from the top of our browser window here. So if I save it, notice that the top of our element is right on the top edge of the browser window. If I set top to 10 pixels, the top of our element is now 10 pixels from the top of the browser window. So top specifies how far away our element is from the top of the window. The next property we can set is left. So if we set left to 0 pixels, then the left side of our element will be on the left edge of our window. If we set left to 50 pixels, for example, now the left side of our element will be 50 pixels from the left of our window. So left tells us how much space is between the element and the left edge of the window. So we can set this in all 4 directions. We've seen top, left. We can also set bottom and right. Now, a special feature of these properties is that if we set it in opposite directions, the element will stretch. So for example, if we set it to left and right, so these two are opposite directions, and we set the right to 50 pixels, notice that the element stretches. So now this element is 50 pixels from the left of the page right here, and it is also 50 pixels from the right of the page. So it will stretch the element to meet these two conditions. Same thing with top and bottom. So if I set bottom to 100 pixels and save it, the element will stretch so that it is 10 pixels from the top and it is 100 pixels from the bottom. So this is how we move this element around and resize it with position fixed. Now let's try creating the header that we see here. So as you can see for this header, it's at the top edge of the page It's also on the left edge and on the right edge. So that means that it's 0 pixels from the top. As a shorthand, we can just write 0. It's 0 pixels from the left, and it's 0 pixels from the right. Now for the bottom, we might first try to calculate how far the bottom of this element is from the bottom of the page. Now that's not going to work if we resize the page, so we need a different approach. So first, let's save this file and go into our practice file. So now you can see that this element is sticking to the top, the left, and the right, which is what we have in our code. Now we have to figure out the height of this div. So in this case, instead of using bottom, because remember the bottom can resize, we want to use simply height. So in addition to these properties, we can simply use height and width to also resize this element. It all depends on what situation you're in. If you want this fixed element to resize with the page, then you would use top, left, right, and bottom. If you just want it to have a specific height or width, and you don't want it to resize, then you use height and width. So here we're going to set the height to 50 pixels, and we don't want it to resize with the page. So that's exactly what we have here. Now when we start scrolling, you'll notice that our header sticks to the top of the page. So that's how we create something like the YouTube header that we see here. Now one last problem is that if we go to our practice file, notice that if we scroll right to the top, the header is covering our first div. So we need to add some spacing at the top to push our content down below the header. To do that, we can go into our code, and the first thing you might think to do is to add margin to the top. So we're going to add spacing to the top, and let's add a little more than 50 pixels, so 60 pixels. So if we save it, and make sure you scroll up all the way to the top of the page, you'll notice that we have 60 pixels of space at the top, and now our content is not covered by the header. Now this is not the best solution, because if our content order changes, for example, if I move this div down here, notice that it doesn't work anymore. So what we want instead is to always have space at the top of our page, regardless of what the content is. So if I move this to the top here and remove margin top, I'm going to show you the proper way to do this. So to properly handle this situation, we need to add spacing to the body element. So let's scroll up to the body. So we have two choices for adding space to the top of our page. We can either use margin or we can use padding. Generally, the best practice is to use padding at the top. So we're just going to add spacing on the inside of our web page at the top of 60 pixels. Let's save it and scroll all the way up. And now we have plenty of space at the top of the page, and our header is not covering our contents. So now that we learned position fixed and how to move this element around and resize it, we're going to go into the project we were currently working on, and we're going to put our header and stick it to the top of the page. So let's learn how to do that. First, I'm going to resize my windows a little bit so it's easier to work with. I'm going to put it right here. And then we're going to open the youtube.html file, which is our project. So remember, we put our CSS into separate files. So I'm going to open the header.css file, and I'll put it on the side so you guys can see it side by side. So just like we learned, we're going to go into the header here. We're going to set a style of position fixed. And remember, to move this, we're going to use top, left, bottom, and right. So top, we want our header to stick to the top of the page. We're going to set that to 0. We want our header 0 pixels from the left, so on the left edge of the page, and also 0 pixels from the right. And finally, we're going to set a height. So we already have it up here. So let's save it and see how it looks. So the first thing we notice is that we lost our background color. Now, the only reason we had a background color was because if we didn't have position fixed, this header takes space on the page. And the page just happens to be white, so the header appears to be white. But now that it's floating above the page, we'll notice that it's actually transparent. So to add our background color again, we just need to set the background color property. So let's set this to white. Save it, and now we're back to where we were. Now if we go to our project and we start scrolling, you'll notice that our header sticks to the top while we scroll. So that's exactly what we want. Next, we have this problem where the header is covering our content. So remember, the way to fix this is to add padding to the top of our body. We're going to go into our code, and we're going to go into this file, general.css. That's where we have styles for the body. And then we're going to set a padding dash top of maybe 60 pixels. Let's take a look. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's compare it to our design. If I scroll to the top here and just compare it a little bit, I notice that our videos are appearing at a higher position than our design. So we're going to push them down a little more. Let's set this to maybe 80 pixels. Save it. So we push them down even more. And I think that looks close enough to our design. So the last thing I notice is that we're missing the border at the bottom of our header here. So let's go ahead and add that. So let's go back into our header CSS. We're going to add a border to the bottom. So we can actually add borders to one side at a time. We don't have to add borders to all four sides. To do that, we're going to set the same border properties we had before. So we're going to start with border width. But in the middle, we're going to tell it a direction. So we can tell it bottom. We can also tell it top, left, and right. So we have all these four directions. In this case, we want a border at the bottom. And we're going to set it to 1 pixels. And the other border properties are the same. So border style is going to be solid, but we only want it at the bottom. So it's going to be border bottom style. And then lastly, border dash bottom dash color. And let's set it to gray. And I'm going to pick a lighter shade of gray. So maybe right there. Save it. Let's compare it to our design. So it looks like it's a little darker than what we have. I'm just going to adjust the color to match our design. It's not going to be perfect, but remember, you can always inspect the design and then make it perfect. Okay, so now if I compare it, I think that looks pretty close enough. And now if I scroll, you notice that the header is sticking to the top, which is exactly what we want. Next, we're going to learn how to create this sidebar. So the sidebar is just like the header, it sticks while we scroll. So this is another example of position fixed. We're going to go back to our practice file, and I'll resize my pages here. And I'm going to open position.html we were practicing with. And this time, below the header, we're going to create our sidebar. So let's create a div, and this div is going to be our sidebar. Now for the sidebar, let's set a style, and then inside we're going to set a background color of green this time. So a background dash color, green, and a text color of white, so that it's easier to distinguish between all of these different elements. Next, we're going to stick the sidebar to our browser. So remember, to do that, we're going to use position fixed. So position fixed, and save it. And now when we scroll, you'll notice that the sidebar is sticking to our browser while we scroll. Lastly, we're going to put the sidebar in the right place using top, left, right, height, or width. So let's look at our sidebar in our design. We notice that the sidebar is sticking to the bottom, so we want bottom 0. It's sticking to the left, so we want left 0. And for the top, it's actually not reaching to the top of the page. Otherwise, it would cover up the header. So there's quite a difference between the sidebar here and the top of the page. So let's go back into our practice file and learn how to position that. Let's start with left. We want the sidebar to stick to the left side of the page. So we're going to say 0 pixels from the left. Save it. Now we want our sidebar to stick to the bottom of the page. So we're going to say bottom and 0 pixels from the bottom. And finally, we want it to be at the top of the page, but not cover the header. So let's set the top to 50 pixels, right? So it's going to meet right where the header ends. We're going to set this to 50 pixels, and then save. And finally, we want to set the width of the sidebar. So for the sidebar, we don't want it to resize with the page. So that's why we're going to use the width property instead of something like right. So let's go back into our practice file, and we're going to set the width to maybe 72 pixels. Save it, and that looks like what we have in our design. So that's perfect. Now we have the same problem again, where our fixed element is covering our content. So let's scroll back to the top. We're going to add padding to our body so that these elements are not covered by the sidebar. So in this case, we want extra space on the left side. So we're going to set padding -left, and let's set it to 80 pixels, which is more than the sidebar's width of 72 pixels. So now if we save this, we have 80 pixels of padding on the left side of the page, and now the sidebar is not covering our content. So that's how we position a sidebar. Now we're going to create the sidebar in our project here. So let's go back into youtube.html. I'm going to resize my page so that we can see it better. And we're going to create a sidebar on the left. So let's go into our code, and we're going to put the sidebar right below our header. So let's scroll down below our header here. I'm going to create a div. This is going to be our sidebar. And I'm going to give a class of sidebar so that we can target it in our CSS. Now for these styles, let's actually put them in a separate CSS file. So if we scroll up to the top, we have CSS files for our header, for our videos. So it makes sense to split up our sidebar styles into their own file so that we organize our code better. We're going to go into our code editor and then go into the styles folder here. And we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it sidebar.css. And I'm going to put it on the side like this. Next, we're going to load sidebar.css into our HTML. So we just have to do one of these again. Just going to copy them. And then instead of video.css, we're going to load sidebar.css. And now we're ready to style this sidebar that we just created. So let's target the sidebar class. And we're going to set position to fixed to make it stick. Now for the sidebar, we want it to be 0 pixels from the left of our browser. So let's set left to 0. And we also want it to stick to the bottom of our browser. So bottom to 0. And finally, we want it to stretch to the top, but we don't want it to cover our header. So let's set the top to whatever the height of our header is. So if we go to header.css, which is here, we can check the height of our header is 55 pixels. So we're going to go into our sidebar here, and we're going to get the sidebar to end 50 pixels or 55 pixels from the top. So let's set that to 55 pixels, save it. So remember, with position fixed, the element is no longer on the page anymore, and it doesn't have a background color. So we just have to set that again. Background-color, we're going to set it to white. Save it, and now we have our sidebar. The final thing is to make our sidebar as wide as our design, which is right here. So we're going to set the width to 72 pixels. Save it, and let's compare it to our design. And I think it's hard to see because it's white here and it's a little bit gray here, but I think that's close enough. Now the next problem we have is that the sidebar is covering our content. So as we learned, we're going to add some padding to the left to push our content over. So let's go into our general styles, so general.css, and we're going to style the body. We're going to add padding to the left of our body. And let's add padding of 80 pixels again. And now our sidebar is no longer covering our content because we added a bunch of padding to the left of our page. So that's how we use position fixed to create elements that stick to the page while we scroll, like our header and our sidebar. For now, here's some exercises that you can do on your own to get a better understanding of CSS position. Now we're going to learn another position property that we can use. Let's go into our position practice file, and the same in our code editor. We're going to open up position.html and then close all of these files. So I'm going to resize it so that we can see it better. So this time we're going to learn position absolute. Let's do an example to see how it works. So let's scroll down, and we're going to create a div below our sidebar to practice position absolute. Let's create a div, and then let's call this absolute. And now we're going to set some styles on this div. So style equals, and then inside here, we're going to set position with a value of absolute. And we're also going to set a background color of red so that it's easier to see. So background color of red, and then the text color is going to be white. So color of white. Save it. And now we have our position absolute element. So before we continue, make sure we scroll all the way up to the top of our page. Now position absolute also takes the same values as position fixed. So top left, bottom, and right, as well as width and height, but they behave a little bit differently. So first we're going to set left. So let's set the left property to 0. And let's save it. And now the left side of our element is 0 pixels from the left side of our page. So this works the same way as position fixed. If we set left to 10 pixels, now there will be 10 pixels between our element and the left side of our page. Now let's try setting top. So we're going to set the top to 10 pixels. Save it and make sure you scroll all the way up. So you'll notice that our element is now 10 pixels from the top of the page. So mostly these properties work the same as position fixed, but with one key difference. For position fixed, the elements are placed in the browser window, while for position absolute, the elements are placed on the page. Now what I mean by this is that when we scroll, the browser window, or just this visible part, is not moving. Only the page is moving up and down. So for position fixed, we're going to put these elements on the browser window, which doesn't move when we scroll. So if we scroll up to the header, if I say top and 10 pixels, this puts the header 10 pixels from the top of the browser window, not from the top of the page, which is constantly moving up and down. But for position absolute, if we scroll down to there, we're putting it 10 pixels from the top of the page, which scrolls up and down when we move. So that's a key difference between the two. Position fixed positions the element in the browser, which doesn't move when we scroll, and position absolute positions the element on the page, which does move when we scroll. So let's go back up and reset this to 0 so that we have our proper header again, and do some more practice with position absolute. So for example, if I wanted to put this absolute element in the top right corner here on our page, we can do something like right, and we'll put it 10 pixels from the right, and then top, we can put it maybe 60 pixels from the top. So 60. Save it, and we scroll all the way up, and that's how we place an element on a precise location on our page like this. And because it's on our page, when we scroll, the page will move up, and this absolute element will move up with the page. Now, one thing that's weird is that this element is appearing above our header. And that's because this element was written in our code below our header. So generally, an element that is written below is going to appear in front of elements that are written above it. Now, we can actually override this if we scroll up by adding another property called z-index. So z-index determines which elements appear in front and which elements appear behind. So the default z-index is 0. This is the same thing as if you didn't have this at all, but an element with a higher z-index will appear in front of elements with a lower z-index. So if we set the z-index of the header to 1, it's going to have a higher z-index than the absolute element, which has a default z-index of 0. If we save it, now the header will appear in front. Just as an example, if we scroll down and we set the z-index of this absolute element and we set it to 2, now it's going to appear in front again because our z-index here is greater than our z-index here. So usually we set this to something like 100 so that we can have a lot of elements in between if our page has a lot of layers. And usually if we don't care about the z-index, we can just remove it and have a default of 0. Now that we learned position absolute, where do we use this? The truth is, we don't use it like this very much. This is not a common situation that we run into when we're creating websites. However, position absolute has another key feature that makes it really, really useful. To demonstrate, we're going to take this element and we're going to make a copy of it and we're going to put it inside the sidebar. So like right here. So we're going to put a position absolute inside a position fixed. So now when we save, you'll notice that this element is not being placed on the page anymore. What it's actually doing is placing this element relative to this position fixed element. So now right of 10 pixels is actually 10 pixels from the right of the fixed element, which is the sidebar. Top of 60 pixels is 60 pixels from the top of the sidebar, not from the top of the page. So whenever position absolute is inside a position fixed element, it's going to be placed relative to this position fixed element. So this is the most important feature of position absolute. So let me show you why it's so useful. Let's say that we wanted a close button on the top right of our sidebar. We want to be able to close our sidebar if we want to. I'm going to change this to an X so that it's kind of like a close button. And then to put it in the top right of our sidebar, we just have to set the top to 0 and the right to 0. So if I save that, now this element is in the top right. And that's because if position absolute is inside position fixed, top 0 means 0 pixels from the top of the position fixed element. Right 0 means 0 pixels from the right of the position fixed element. So this is how we attach elements to the corners or the sides of other elements. If we look at our final project, we can see that going on in our videos. Here we have the video time in the corner of our thumbnail. Here we have the notification count in the top right corner of this icon. And using position absolute, it allows us to put elements in the corner like this. So there's one last thing we need to learn. Here we have a position absolute inside a position fixed element. That's why we can put it in the corner. But notice that this is still a position fixed element and it sticks to the page. But in our final project, these videos are not sticking to the page. They're scrolling with the page and we're still able to put stuff in the corners. So how do we achieve this? And to do this, we're going to learn another value for the position property called position relative. We're going to scroll down to our two divs at the bottom. And for our second div, we're going to set the position to relative and save it. Now, if we go back to our page, we'll notice that nothing actually changed. And that's how position relative works. It still displays the element as normal, except if we put position absolute in here, it will position it relative to this element instead of relative to the page. So let's go through an example to see what I mean. If I scroll up here, let's copy this absolute element. Let's copy it and then paste it inside this position relative element. Save it and then reformat it a bit, press tab. And if we save this, you'll notice that we get the same effect as when we put position absolute in position fixed. Right of 10 pixels now means 10 pixels from the right of the position relative element, not 10 pixels from the right of the page. Top of 60 pixels means 60 pixels from the top of the position relative element, not 60 pixels from the top of the page. So two things are happening here. When position absolute is inside position relative, this will be positioned on the element, not on the page. So that's what we just talked about. The second thing that happens here is that position relative causes this whole element to display normally. So that's what we get in our final project. Notice that these videos are displayed normally, they scroll with the page, but we have something in the bottom right corner. So these are all position relative, and then to put something in the bottom right corner, we're going to put a position absolute inside. So let's actually go through an example here. So we have our position relative element, we have position absolute inside. I'm going to put this in the bottom right corner, just like our design. So let's change this to 5 minutes and pretend this is like our final project. Let's change the background color to black. And now we're going to put this on the bottom right corner. So let's get rid of this first. And we're going to put this 10 pixels from the bottom of the position relative element. So we're going to say bottom 10 pixels. And we're also going to put it 10 pixels from the right of this position relative element. So right of 10 pixels. And that's how we position this in the corner. And because this is position relative, if we scroll the page, it acts like normal content. So now that we learned the technique of position absolute inside position relative, we're going to apply that to our project and create the video time as well as the notification number here. So let's go back to our project and we're going to add video times first. So let's go to youtube.html and we're also going to open the video.css file. I'm going to put it down here because we're working with styles for the videos. So first we're going to find our thumbnail, which is right here. And now remember, to put something in the corner, we're going to need position absolute inside a position relative element. So if we look at our code, what could be our position relative element? Well, it can't really be the image element because image elements aren't really containers. We can't put something inside it. So what we could use is this thumbnail row element. This could be our relative element, and then the video time will be the absolute element inside of here. So first, let's create our video time. We're going to create a div, and let's give it a class of video-time. And then inside, we're going to put a video time. So let's go to our final project, and we're going to copy one of these. So 1420. Then inside, I'm going to put 14:20. Let's save it and go back. So right now, it's just a normal div. Let's go to our CSS file, and we're going to style this. Let's scroll all the way down. And we're going to target video-time class. And let's set the background dash color to black and the text color to white. So just like our final project. So now we're ready to position it properly. We're going to need position absolute inside position relative. So first, let's set the position relative on here. We're going to scroll up to thumbnail row, which is right here. We're going to set position relative. And remember, position relative doesn't really change anything. Everything appears normal. That's one of the benefits of it. And if we scroll down, we're going to change this to position absolute. And now top, bottom, left, and right will be placed inside our position relative element. So if we save it, and now if we want to put it in the bottom right corner, we just have to say bottom 0 pixels from the bottom and also 0 pixels from the right. So let's set the position from the bottom to maybe 10 pixels. Let's save it. Okay, And let's set the position from the right side to maybe 5 pixels. Save it. Okay, let's change this to maybe 8 pixels. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. And if we compare it to our final design, it's in the right position. So that's how we put an element in the corner of another element. We need a position absolute inside a position relative. So finally, let's style this one by one until it matches our design. I'm actually going to move this to the bottom here so that it's easier to compare. The first thing we're going to do is to change the font. So we're going to set font-family to Roboto, Arial, like the rest of our fonts. And next, let's change the font size. Let's change it to font-size of maybe 12 pixels. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's make it a little bit bolder. Let's change the font-weight to 500. And remember, a font weight of 400 is normal, 700 is bold, and 500 is semi-bold. Let's save that. That looks pretty good. And next we need spacing on the inside of this element. So that's padding. So let's add some padding on the left of maybe 2 pixels. And same for padding on the right, 2 pixels. And then padding on the top of 4 pixels. And then padding on the bottom of 4 pixels. Save that. That looks pretty good. Let's add some more padding on the left and right. Change this to 4 pixels and 4 pixels. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Next, we're going to make our corner rounded, kind of like this. So to do that, we're going to use border radius. Change the border dash radius to 2 pixels. Save it. And I think that looks pretty close to our design. And there we go. We created the video time in the bottom right corner of the thumbnail. Now to give you guys a bit more practice, I'm going to get you to add the video time to all of our other videos. So inside our HTML, you're going to add this video time to the next video here and all the videos in the HTML. So take some time to complete that, and then we'll continue the lesson. So now that we have the video time for all of our videos, we're going to run into another problem. If we start scrolling up on this page, you notice that the thumbnails appear above our header. But another thing is that the other content like this text and the channel image will appear below our header. So what exactly is going on? So we mentioned this briefly in the practice file. If an element like this video preview is written below another element, like the header up here, the element that is written below will appear in front. That's what's happening here. We have a header, and then below that we have the thumbnail, which is going to appear on top of the header. However, what I didn't mention is that this rule doesn't apply to position static, or these elements with the default position. Position static will always appear at the back. So that's why you see that these always appear at the back. As soon as we set it to something that's not position static, like position relative, the rules of which element was written first start to apply. So in this case, because if we scroll up, the thumbnail row is position relative, and it's written below the header in the code, it's going to appear on top of the header, which is what we see. And remember, to fix this, we need to set a property of z-index. Let's go into our header CSS file. I'm going to open this file here. And then inside the header, we need to set a z-index to make the header appear above the thumbnails. So let's set a z-index of 100 so that we have room if we want to put stuff between these two. Now if I save it, the header has a z-index of 100. The thumbnail row has a default z-index of 0. 100 is greater than 0. That means the header will appear on top of all the thumbnails. So if we go back and we start scrolling, you'll notice that we're now all good. The last thing we'll learn is how to create this notification count in the top right corner of this icon. So let's go into our HTML so youtube.html, and find where the code for this notification is. So if we scroll down to the header and then scroll down to the right side, that's this code here, notification icons. So I'm going to resize my windows so we can see it properly here. And now we want to put a notification number in the top right corner. So remember, like we've been doing, we need a position absolute inside a position relative. So if we look at our HTML, what could we use as our position relative element? So it can't really be this image because we can't put stuff inside an image element. So one option is this div up here. But a better option is actually to wrap this image element inside a div. So we're going to create a div here. And we're going to put this image inside this div. So remember that the div just creates a box around whatever's inside. So it's not going to change the appearance of this image. However, by creating this div, we can now make this position relative. And that's going to help us add stuff to the top right corner. So let's give this div a class so that we can style it later. Let's call it notifications-icon-container. And inside we're going to have our notification count. Let's create a div for our notification count. Let's give it a count of 3. And let's set this class equals notifications with an S dash count. And now we're ready to style this and put it in the corner. So let's go into header.css. I'm going to put it on the side so we can see it more clearly. And now to start off, let's scroll down to where we have our notification code. So we'll scroll all the way down and we'll find it right here. And now remember, we're going to have position relative, and then inside we're going to have position absolute. So let's style the .notifications -icon -container and set this to position relative, and then the notifications count -count, and we'll set this to position absolute. So we want to put this in the top right corner. So let's set the top to 0 pixels and the right to 0 pixels. And to see it better, let's set a background color. So background-color of red and a text color of white. And now if we save that, it's sort of in the top right corner, but it's a little bit too big. So we're going to style it just like our design here. So I'm going to move this up here actually so that we have a better reference. And now we're going to style it by first changing the font. So let's change the font-family to Roboto, Arial, like before. Next, we'll change the font size. So this is pretty small. Let's change the font-size to maybe 10 pixels. Okay, it should be a little bit bigger. Let's set it to 12 pixels. Okay, that looks pretty good. And let's add some spacing on the inside of the element. Let's add some padding left of maybe 4 pixels, padding right of 4 pixels, padding top of 2, and padding -bottom of 2 pixels. And remember, to make this a circle, we're going to give it round corners. So let's set the border -radius to 10 pixels. So it looks like we're a little bit too tall here. We're going to stretch out the sides by adding more padding to the sides. Let's change this to maybe 5 pixels, left and right, save it. Okay, maybe 6 pixels, left and right, save it. Okay, so that looks like a pretty good circle. Next, we'll change the background color to something that looks like that. So I'm just going to pick something like this maybe. Save. Perfect. And I'm going to change the font size down just a little bit more because this is pretty small. Let's change this to 11. Save that. And let's change the padding left and the right because it's a little bit long on the horizontal side. And now we have a circle again. So notice that we put this element in the top right corner using these two properties, but it's not enough. We actually want it out even more. So we're already at the top edge of our position relative container. How can we go even higher? So the trick here is to use negative numbers. So now this will be positioned beyond the top edge of our container. So if I save it here, this is now 5 pixels beyond the top edge of our relative container. Same thing with right. If we set it to -5 pixels here, it's now 5 pixels beyond the right edge. So I'm just going to adjust the values here so that it matches our design. So let's set the top to something like -2. Okay, so I think that looks pretty close to our design, and I'm pretty happy with it. So in this lesson, we learned CSS position, which is one of the most important skills in CSS. It allows us to create elements like this header and sidebar that stick to the page while we scroll, and it allows us to add elements on top of other elements. For example, the video time on top of the thumbnail, and the notification count on top of the notification icon. So with that, we learned all the major skills that we need in HTML and CSS to complete our project. In the last lesson, we're going to create all the other features that we're missing, including the sidebar, the tooltips, and making our current project look like the final design here. In this lesson, we're going to finish our final project. We're going to create the sidebar. We'll resize our video so that it looks like our design here. And lastly, we're going to create the tooltips when we hover over these icons. We'll start off with the sidebar. So I'm going to rearrange my windows here so that it's a little easier to copy. So I put the design on the left. I'm going to put our current sidebar on the right here. And I'll resize my windows so we can see it better. And now we're ready to begin. So let's open our code editor, and we're going to open youtube.html. And then we're going to scroll down to the sidebar code, which is right here. So let's take a look at the design of this sidebar, our reference design. If I hover over it, you can see that it's just a bunch of boxes. And inside each box, we have an icon, some text, and they're centered horizontally and vertically. So we're going to start step by step. We're first going to create the box. Let's go into our code. And instead of this text, we're going to create 6 boxes. We're going to use a div to create each box. Let's give this div a class of sidebar-link. And I'm going to copy and paste this 6 times. 4, 5, 6. Next, we're going to style these so that they have the same size as these boxes. We're going to go into our CSS. So let's go into sidebar.css. I'm going to put this on the right side here so we can see it better. And now we're ready to style these. Let's target the class sidebar-link. And for each of these, let's give it a background color so that we can see them. And let's set it to light gray. And we'll also give them a height because without any content in the divs, they have a height of 0. So let's set a height of 50 pixels. And let's save it. And let's see how that looks. Okay, so it's hard to tell the difference between them. So let's add some spacing at the bottom of each div so that we can differentiate them. We're going to add margin dash bottom of 1 pixel. Save it. Okay, so from this, it looks like our boxes are a little bit too short. So we're going to make them taller. Let's try a height of maybe 75. Okay, so I think that's pretty close. we can get rid of this margin at the bottom and actually increase this to 76 so that we compensate for the margin that we removed. And next, when we look at the design, these boxes are usually white, but when we hover over them, they turn gray. So instead of having this background color gray here, we're just going to set the background color when we hover over this. So let's set a hover style dot sidebar dash link colon hover. And when we hover, we're going to set the background color to light gray. Let's save it. Now when we hover, it's light gray. But our design is actually a lot lighter than that. So I'm going to change the color here. I'm going to pick something a little lighter than this. Maybe something here. Let's save that and check it out. And yep, I think that looks pretty close. Next, we're going to add the content in each of these boxes. So first, we actually need to download all of these icons. So we did it before for these icons. And just a reminder, to do that, we're going to right-click and inspect. So you'll see that this actually covers up the sidebar. What we can do is click these three dots in the top right, and then we can move the DevTools to another side of the web page. So I'm going to move it to the right side here. And now we can see the full sidebar. Then we're going to click this in the top left, click one of these icons, and you'll get the URL to download them here. So hover over this URL and then click this. And now we can Control S. And I'll save it in the folder that contains my code in the icons folder. So make sure you do this for all 6 of these icons, and I'll see you back after you're done. Alright, so once we've downloaded all of the icons from the sidebar here, we're going to add them to our HTML. So let's go into each of these and add our icons. Inside this first div, we're going to add an image element, and we're going to set a source attribute. And we're going to load the icon, icons/home.svg, because this is the home icon. And let's save it. And now we have our icon. It's a little bit too big, but we're going to resize it after. For now, let's copy this and add the icons for all of these other boxes. So we're going to add, for this one, we're going to add the explore icon. So explore.svg. And for this one is the subscriptions. And then for this one, it's originals. And then for this one, it's YouTube-music. And the last one is library. So I'm going to go down here, change this to library. Perfect. Next, we're going to make these icons smaller. So usually we would set a class on these images so that we can style them with CSS. But for this lesson, I'm going to show you another way that we can target these images. So let's go into our sidebar styles, and we're going to learn a new CSS technique. So we already learned that this text before the brackets here, this tells the computer which elements we're styling. In this case, the dot means we're targeting a class, and we're styling all elements that have the class sidebar link, which are these elements. So this bit of text is called a CSS selector. And there's actually a lot of different selectors that we can use in CSS. So we already learned the class name selector, which looks like this and starts with a dot. And we learned the element name selector, which just starts with the element's name. Another thing we can do with CSS is to combine selectors together. For example, if we said dot sidebar dash link and then wrote a comma, down here we can add another selector. So let's say we also want to target dot header. So now all of the styles inside the brackets will target all elements with the sidebar link class and all elements with the header class. This is an example of a more advanced selector. Another selector we can use is, instead of a comma, we can use a space. And then type another selector like image. So when we have a space between these two, this means that we're targeting all images inside all sidebar links. So we're going to target these images inside sidebar links only. We're not going to target all images on the page. So let's style these images and make them smaller. We're going to set a height and let's try 24 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so I think that looks pretty close to what we have in the design. Next, we're going to center these horizontally and vertically, and finally add the text. So to center something vertically is actually challenging in CSS. The best way to do it is to use a flexbox. If we look into our code editor and open our flexbox example, so flexbox.html, and then we right click and open with live server, we have a bunch of examples of using flexbox. In the last example here, we're doing vertical alignment. If we scroll down to our example in our HTML, we have this property called align items center. So this vertically centers our content. Here we also have an example of horizontal centering. If we scroll up to that example, which is this one, we have the property justify content center. So using justify content center and align item center, we can put it both horizontally and vertically centered. So let's go back into our project and use a flexbox to center these. We're going to go back to our CSS and we're going to make each of these sidebar links a flexbox. So let's set the display property to flex. And we're going to set justify dash content to center. So this will center horizontally. Let's save it. And now they're horizontally centered. And then align dash items center for vertical centering. So this is coming along great. Next, we're going to add the text. So underneath each of these, let's add a div. So div. So for this first one, it's going to be called home. And I'm just going to copy these and replace it with each of these texts. So explore. This one is subscriptions. Originals. YouTube music. And library. Now let's start styling this text a little bit. I'm going to use this advanced CSS selector again. We're going to go into the sidebar link class, and then we're going to target all the divs inside sidebar link. So we're going to target divs. So this is not going to target all divs on the page, only the divs inside sidebar link. Let's change the font here first. So we'll set the font dash family to Roboto, comma Arial, like before. And let's make the text smaller next. We're going to set the font dash size to maybe 12 pixels. Okay, maybe 10 pixels. Save it. And now the next problem we have is that our elements are appearing beside each other, not on top of each other. So why is this happening? So remember that we can set a property called flex dash direction colon row. If we go into our flexbox example, flexbox.html, and we scroll all the way to the top, this was the first thing that we learned, display flex and flex direction row. So if we open this in our browser and we scroll to the first example, flex direction row causes our elements to be displayed horizontally. So notice that these two are divs, but they're displayed next to each other, not on top of each other. Now to change this, we're actually going to go back and we're going to use flex direction column. So where flex direction row displays them horizontally, flex direction column displays our elements vertically. So if we save it, now it's displaying our elements one on top of each other. So this is another direction that we can use for our flexboxes. By default, flexboxes are flex direction row, so they will appear horizontally. but we can set flex direction column when we don't want that behavior. So for flex direction column, these two properties are actually switched. So if I remove both of them first, and I first use justify dash content colon center, save it. Justify content now affects the vertical direction instead of the horizontal direction with flex direction row. And if I use align dash items center, align items now affects the horizontal direction. So for flex direction column, these two are reversed. It's a little bit confusing, but the more that you use Flexbox, the more you'll get used to it. All right, so we're almost done. We're just going to add some space between these two. To add some space, let's add some margin bottom to the image. So margin dash bottom, maybe 4 pixels. Save it. Okay, I think that looks pretty close to me. And it looks like our elements are a little bit too tall. So I'm actually going to scroll up and adjust the height here to maybe 74. Save it. And okay, that looks pretty good. So one last thing with the sidebar is that I noticed in our design, it kind of covers the header while ours does not. So to change that, remember we can change the z-index to be higher than whatever the header is. So if we go into our header styles, header.css, notice that the z-index is 100. So we're going to change our z-index to bigger than that. So 200, save it. And now our sidebar is covering our header. Next, I want to move all of these icons down a little bit more so that it's aligned. So to do that, I'm going to add some padding or spacing to the top of this. So we're going to add some padding dash top of maybe 5 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so that looks perfect. And actually one last thing is I'm going to make the cursor a pointer when we hover over it. So let's go into our sidebar link and we'll set the cursor to a pointer. Save it. And now this looks good to go. Next, we're going to resize these videos to match the design. So I'm going to move this back into one window. And I'm going to resize this so that we have 3 videos in each row. And now we can properly switch back and forth to compare. So as I switch back and forth between these, you can see that there's a size difference between the videos. So we're going to fix that. So for our website, I noticed that the left edge here can be moved to the right a little more. So if we look at our design, it's more to the right. Go back to our current project, design more to the right. So to move this to the right, we're actually using padding. So we have to increase our padding on the left side of the page. Let's go back into our code and we're going to find the padding, which is in general.css. So remember we added padding to the left side of the body. That's what's pushing these elements over here. So let's increase the padding to maybe 96. Save it. And let's compare it to the design. All right, so I think that looks perfect. And we also have padding on the right, while our website does not. So let's actually also add padding dash right of 24 pixels. Now if we save that there and compare it to our design, our videos are now exactly the right size. So that looks great to me. The next thing we're going to tweak is if we look at our design, the background color here is a light gray, while our background color is white. So we're going to make the background color of our entire page a shade of gray like this. So let's go into our CSS and in our body styles in general CSS, let's set the background dash color to light gray. And I'm going to hover over this and select a lighter color, maybe 248. Let's save it and let's compare it to our design. So this is our website and this is the design. I think that looks pretty close. And the last few details I want to adjust is this part. So if I look at my design and I compare it to my website, it looks like our channel pictures are a little bit too big. So if I look at the design here, so we could make them a little smaller. So let's go into our code and we're going to go into the video styles. Let's open video.css. We're going to find the profile picture. So if I scroll down, so this image here is the channel picture. It has a class of profile picture. We're going to decrease the width to maybe 36. Save it, compare it to our design. Okay, so I think that's the right size. Next, I'm going to adjust some of the spacing here. So if I compare to the design, there's actually a little bit less spacing here than our website. So I'm going to decrease that. So for our website, we're adding some margin bottom to the thumbnail row. I'm going to decrease this to maybe 8 pixels. Let's see how that looks. And then compare it to our design. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. And finally, I'm going to adjust the spacing between these two. So for our video title, we go into our code and scroll up here. It has a margin bottom of 12. I'm going to decrease it a little bit to 10. Save it and compare it. Okay, so I think that's good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's a little bit off. But I think that our current website here looks really good to me anyways. The final thing we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to create these tooltips when we hover over these icons. So before we learn how to make these appear when we hover over, let's just create these tooltips and place them below each icon. So let's go into our website and we're going to add some tooltips to these. So we'll go into our code and I'm going to resize the windows so we can see better. So we're going to go into our HTML. We're going to scroll up to our header and let's first find the search icon here, which is in the middle section and then the search button here. So to create the tooltips, we're actually going to use the position property that we learned earlier. So remember that we use position to put this number in the top right corner. We're going to use position to put a tooltip below the element right here. So let's first add a tooltip inside the button. So I'm going to create a div and let's call this search. Let's save it. And now that's our tooltip. And now we need to position this tooltip relative to our button. So remember from the previous lesson, we need position absolute inside position relative. So let's first add those position properties. So we're going to go into the header CSS file because we're working with the header. So let's open that up. And I'm going to move it to the right side here. And now we're going to scroll down until we find our search button. So I'm going to scroll, and it's right here. So we're going to set this search button, which is our container, to position : relative. Save it, and nothing happens because that's how position relative works. And now the magic comes when we set this to position absolute. So we're actually going to set a class here so that we can target it a little easier. We're going to call this tooltip. And we're going to use that advanced CSS selector we learned earlier. So we're going to target search-button first, and then we're going to type a space, and then we're going to type .tooltip. So this means that we're targeting the .tooltip class not on the entire page, but only inside the search button. So now we don't have to come up with a unique name for this specific tooltip. So if we save it, we're going to set this to position absolute. And now we have an absolute element inside a relative element. So if we save that, now we can start positioning this. Let's give a background color so that we can see it better. So background dash color of maybe gray. And let's set the text color to white. So color colon white. Let's give it some padding on the inside. So padding top of maybe 4 pixels. Padding dash bottom 4 pixels. Padding left 4 pixels and padding right 4 pixels. Save it. And let's actually increase the padding on the left and right to 8. Let's see how that looks. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. And now I'm going to set some rounded corners. So we don't have to exactly match our design. We can make it close enough. So we can set some rounded corners, border dash radius of 4 pixels. It's a little too much for me. Set to 2 pixels. And I'm also going to make the font a little bit smaller. So I'm going to set the font dash size to 12 pixels. Save it. I think that looks pretty good to me. Next, we're going to use the properties top, bottom, left, and right to position this within the relative element. So for our cases, let's start with bottom 0. So this means that the bottom of our tooltip will be at the bottom of the button. If I save this, that's exactly what we have. Now to move it even further to the bottom, we're going to use negative pixels. So let's set negative 20. Save it. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good. Let's increase it a little bit more. Let's increase it to 30 pixels. Save it. Okay, so I'm happy with that position. Now we're going to learn how to make this tooltip appear when we hover over this button. So the trick here is we're going to set the opacity, or how see-through the tooltip is, to 0, which is completely invisible. And then when we hover over this button, we're going to set the opacity to 1. So how do we actually change this when we hover over the button? So we're actually going to use a combination of this advanced CSS selector and pseudo classes, which are like hover. So first, we're going to target the search dash button class, and we're going to add a pseudo class :hover. And now we're going to type another selector. We're going to type dot tooltip. And we're going to set some styles here. So what this does is that we're going to target the tooltips only when we're hovering over this search button. So up here, notice that we're targeting the tooltips inside the search button, regardless of whether if we're hovering over it or not. In this case, we're going to target all tooltips inside the search button, but only when we hover over it. So when we hover over it, we can set the tooltip opacity to 1. So this is a neat trick that you can do to create tooltips like this. So if we go into our web page, when I'm not hovering over the button, you'll notice that the opacity is 0. But when I'm hovering over the button, this tooltip will have an opacity of 1, which looks like this. And now because we're changing the opacity, we can set a transition. So let's set a transition. We need to tell it what to transition, which is opacity, and how long the transition will take. Let's say 0.15 seconds. Save it. And when we hover over this, now we get our tooltips. Now the last thing I want to show you is if we hover over the actual tooltip, you'll notice that because it's inside this button, when we hover over the tooltip with our mouse, it also counts as hovering over the button. We can fix this by disabling hovers on the tooltip and only allow hovers on the button. So to disable the hover on this tooltip, we're going to use another CSS property called pointer-events: none. This means that when our mouse hovers over the tooltip, it's not going to do anything. So that's how we create these tooltips on our web page. Let's do the same thing with this voice search button. We're going to go into our HTML and we're just going to copy this tooltip and just move it down here into the voice search button. Just like that. And let's change the text to search with your voice. Save it. And now remember to position this. We're going to have position absolute inside position relative. So let's turn this to position relative first. I'm actually going to make it easier for us. I'm going to first target the search dash button. And I'm going to put this inside here. And I'm also going to target with a comma the voice search button. So this one. So now this code is going to apply to both of these. So it saves us a little bit of coding. Same thing down here. We're going to apply all of these styles to the search button tooltip and comma the voice search button dot tooltip. So using these advanced CSS selectors can save us a lot of code. I'm going to scroll down all the way here too and use a comma and set this to the voice dash search button. So make sure you don't have a comma at the end there. Let's save it. Now when I hover over this, you'll notice that it doesn't really work because the text is sort of wrapping around. We're going to fix that by setting this property, white space, no wrap. Save it, and this will prevent the text from wrapping around. Now the last thing I want to do is to center this tooltip with the button. To do this, we can use a flexbox, because remember with flexbox, we can center horizontally and vertically. In this case, we want to center horizontally. So we're going to scroll up and we're going to make these buttons flexboxes. So let's set display, flex. By default, it's flex direction row. So justify content is going to center horizontally. So justify content center, and save it. So now if we hover over our buttons, you'll notice that the tooltips are aligned horizontally. But you also notice that our icons are not vertically aligned very well. So let's go back into our code and we're going to align them in the center with align dash items colon center. Save it. So that didn't seem to work, but if we scroll down into our code, so way earlier in the course, we actually added margin top to the search icon as well as the voice search icon. So we just need to get rid of this margin top and let the flexbox handle the vertical centering. So if we save that, now the icons are perfectly centered, and if we hover over, we have a centered tooltip. The tooltips for these icons are the same thing, except if we scroll down, we currently just have an image. We're going to need a container like this that's going to act as our position relative container. So let's create a div that's going to contain our upload icon. Let's cut this and then paste it in here. Let's give a class of upload-icon-container. And then inside this container, we're going to have our tooltip. So let's copy this and then paste it in here. And let's call this, let's look at our design, create. So our tooltip is going to have the text create. Next, we're going to change this to position relative and position absolute inside. So let's scroll up, and we already have this code here that sets to position relative and centers everything. We're going to add to this the upload icon container dot upload dash icon dash container. Save it. And then we need a position absolute on this tooltip. So again, we can just add it in here so we don't have to copy all this code again. With a comma, dot upload dash icon dash container dot tooltip. Save it. And lastly, we're going to scroll down and add it to here so that appears when we hover. So let's set dot upload dash icon container and dot, when we hover over it, the tooltip is going to have opacity of 1. Let's save it and hover over. All right, so that looks pretty good. But let's change the font here. So let's go into this code, which sets our tooltip styles, and let's set the font-family to Roboto, Arial, like before. If we save it and we hover over it, now we have a nice looking tooltip on our icons. So that's how we create these tooltips when we hover over these icons and these buttons. Creating tooltips for these two other icons are the same thing, and I'm going to leave it as an exercise for you to do on your own. So in this lesson, we finished up our final project. We created the sidebar, resized our videos, created the tooltips, and now if we compare it to our design, our project looks pretty much perfect and ready to go. So here's some exercises you can try on your own to wrap up everything that we learned in this course. In the previous lesson, we finished our final project, which is this. In this lesson, I'm going to show you some more useful features of CSS. We're going to start off with responsive design. If we go to our reference design here, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see. If I make the page smaller, you'll notice that we now have 2 videos in each row. If I make the page bigger, we have 4 videos. So notice that at every screen size, the layout adjusts so that the website looks good. So that's the idea of responsive design, making the website look as good as possible on every screen size. Now, if we make this a little bit more narrow and we switch to our current project, you'll notice that all of our content is sort of squished. So we're going to learn how to implement responsive design into our project. Let's go into our code, and we're going to open the file called video.css, which controls the video grid styles. Let's open that. And now inside, we're going to adjust our video grid so that when the screen size is small, we only have 2 videos per row. And when the screen size is big, we have more than 3 videos per row. So let's go into our code. We're going to scroll down and find the video grid styles. So notice that for these styles, we set 3 columns of equal size. Now to make this responsive, we're going to use something called a media query. So to create a media query, we're going to type @media, and then we're going to give it a screen size. So we're going to say max-width colon maybe 600 pixels. And then we're going to type open squiggly bracket and then close squiggly bracket. So the way this works is that we're going to have a bunch of CSS in here, and this CSS will only activate if the screen size is 600 pixels or less. That's what this max width means. So for example, let's target the video grid class inside here, and let's set the grid-template-columns to 1fr. 1fr. That means from a screen size of 0 to 600 pixels, we're only going to have 2 columns. So we save it and we start to resize. Notice that once we get to 600 pixels, we now have 2 columns in our grid. Now to figure out how big our screen size is, we can right click and inspect. And I'm going to click these 3 dots and move it back down to the bottom like this. And now when we resize, you should see the screen size at the top right of the page. So it's really up to us to pick a screen size where we're going to go from 3 columns to 2. So I think even at this screen size, maybe at 750, it looks a little bit squished. So I'm going to increase this to 750 pixels. Let's save it. And now once we get to 750, we're going to have 2 videos in each row, and it's not going to be as squished anymore. So that's the basics of how to create responsive designs using these media queries. Let's do another example. We're going to have 4 videos per row when our screen size gets really big. So let's set another @media. And for this time, we're going to set a minimum width of maybe 1,000 pixels. And then inside here, we're going to copy this and paste it here. We're going to change grid template columns to 4 columns. So 1 FR, 1 FR. Now if we save it and we resize the browser to 1,000 pixels, it's going to become 4 videos per row. Now you might need to press Command or Control minus to make the web page smaller to see this. But basically the way this works is that once the screen size hits 1,000 pixels, this will activate and we have 4 columns instead of 3. So the last example is that we can actually combine these two. So we can set at media and we can set the min-width to 751 pixels and the max-width to 999 pixels. So this will cover the space between these two measurements here. So let's actually put this in the middle. Okay, so from 0 pixels to a max of 750, we're going to have these styles. And then from 751 to 999, we're going to have these styles. We're going to set this to 3 columns. And then from 1,000 and up, we're going to have 4 columns. So this is the basics of how to create a responsive design like this. You just have to write a lot of media queries. All right, so that's the basics of responsive design. We're going to go back to our web pages. I'm just going to zoom back in and we'll learn the next feature of CSS. So let's go to our project here and open our code. And let's scroll down to this style, the video time. So the next feature we're going to learn is sort of like CSS shortcuts. So instead of setting padding on the left, right, top, and bottom separately like this, we can actually use a property called padding, which is sort of like a shortcut for all 4 of these. So if we set the padding to 4 pixels, this is the same as setting padding on all 4 sides. So we don't need this code anymore. So it makes it a little cleaner for our code to use these shorthand properties. So another thing we can do with this is we can have 2 values. Let's say 4 pixels and 10 pixels. Save it. So this first value is going to be the vertical padding. So padding top, padding bottom. And the second value is horizontal padding, padding left and padding right. The next thing we can do is have 4 directions. So 20 pixels and 30 pixels. Let's see how that looks. So this is how we can set padding in all 4 directions using one line of CSS. This first value is the padding top, second value is the padding right, third value is padding bottom, and fourth is padding left. You can think of this as first you start from the top and then you work your way clockwise around. So that's what these 4 values mean. Another shorthand property is margin. And this is a substitute for margin-left, margin-right, margin top, and margin bottom. So this margin shorthand property works the same way as padding. If we have 1 value, this is all 4 directions. If we have 2 values, this first value is the vertical direction, second is the horizontal direction, and if we have 4 values of margin, this is the top, right, bottom, and left. So these are just examples. We're going to move our styles back to 4 pixels of padding on every side. And we're going to look at one final shorthand property, which is the border. So let's go into our header CSS file and find these styles for this search bar. So we're going to scroll up until we find our search bar, which is here. And notice for our borders, we always set a width, a border style, and a border color. So instead of setting these styles separately, we can use a shorthand called border. So for border, we can set 1 pixel. This is going to be the width. We can set another value of solid. This is going to be the border style. And we can set the third value of color. And so this one line of CSS can replace these 3. If we delete that, then we save, you can see that everything still appears normally, and that's because this border property is a shorthand for the other three. The next thing we're going to learn is called inheritance. Let's go to our youtube.html file, and we're going to scroll down to the video grid, which is right here. So inheritance means that for certain CSS properties, if we set the property on the outer element, it will get passed down to the inner elements, like these. Let's do an example. We're going to set a property on the video grid. We're going to go to the video.css file, and we're going to find the video grid styles, which is all of these. We're going to set it on this style here. So we're going to set it for all screen sizes. Let's add a style. We're going to make the text underlined. To do that, we're going to use this property, text-decoration:_underline. Now, if I save this, you'll see that even though I set text decoration underline on the video grid, all of the paragraphs inside have been underlined. So this is called inheritance. If we set this style on the outer element, which is the video grid, it gets passed down to all the inner elements, which are the paragraphs here. However, not all properties are affected by inheritance. For example, if we go back to the video.css file, and we're going to add a border this time. So let's add a border, and we're going to make it 2 pixels wide, a solid color, and let's just make it red. If I save that, you'll see that the video grid has a border around it, but this border is not passed down to the inner elements here. So inheritance mostly just works with text properties like text decoration underline, color, font weight, and font family. It doesn't affect things like border, padding, or margin. So that's what inheritance means. Certain properties, mostly text properties, will get passed down from the outer element to the inner elements. Now this can save us some code. For example, if we go back to the video.css file, and we scroll down, you can see that the video time uses a style called Font Family Roboto Arial. So this changes the font of our text. And instead of putting it on the video time, we're just going to put it on the entire grid. And then it will get inherited by all the elements inside, which includes the video time. So I can scroll up to the video grid, and I can set the font-family up here. So I can set Roboto, Arial. If I save this, you'll see that nothing changed with the video time because this style is being inherited from the video grid. Now we can actually take this even further. If we go to the youtube.html file, you'll see that this video grid is actually contained within the entire body. So all of our elements on the page are contained within the body. So if we want to set a sort of default text style on the entire page, we can actually just put everything in the body, and that'll save us a lot of code. So let's actually go back to the video.css file. We're going to remove this and save it. You'll see that the video time now goes back to the default font, which is Times New Roman. And these paragraphs actually use a different set of styles. So if we go to the file called general.css, we set the font family for these paragraphs using just a P selector here. If we remove this and save it, you'll see that it goes back to the default font of Times New Roman. Now we're going to set this style on the body so that it gets inherited to the entire web page inside. So we'll go to general.css, and we're going to set font-family to Roboto, Arial to take advantage of inheritance. If I save this, you'll see that all of the fonts went back to Roboto. And that's because we set it on the body, and all of our elements are inside the body, so this style gets inherited to the inner elements. So using this, we can save more code. If we go to our sidebar and our header, if I go to the sidebar first, you'll notice that we're also using font family Roboto Arial. So we can simply get rid of this because this style is being inherited from the body. And if I go to the header.css, you'll notice that we're also using font family Roboto Arial in a bunch of places. So we can just get rid of all of these and take advantage of inheritance to save us some code. All right, so there's one last thing about inheritance that I want to show you. We're going to go back to our video.css file, which is right here. And now let's get rid of these properties that we're using to test with. Save it. This time we're going to go to general.css. We're going to set another style in the body, and we're going to set the property color red to change the text color of the entire page to red. If I save it, you'll see that a lot of the text is now red, like the sidebar and the video titles, but not all of the text has been turned to red. So why is this happening? We mentioned this in one of our earlier lessons. CSS follows a sort of priority when you set the same style on the same element. So for these video author and video stats paragraphs, first we set a color of red from the body, so that gets inherited down. But then if we look at the CSS for these in video.css and go into the video author, which is right here, you can see that we also set the color to this gray color. So the color is being set both by these styles and by the styles that are inherited from the body. However, this style is more specific because it only targets the video author and the video stats, while the style in the body targets the entire page. So that's why this style has higher priority than the inherited style. This is called CSS specificity. Generally, if we set the same style on the same elements, like we have in this situation, the style that is more specific, for example, this style targets only the video author and video stats, the style that is more specific has higher priority, and it will override a more general style, which is what we have here. So using inheritance and specificity, we're able to both set a default style on the outer element, and then if we need to, we can go to the inner element and then override that style. Now in this course, we didn't go through a lot of detail about specificity and its rules, and that's because we were mostly focused on building out this project. But you can find all the details about specificity in the HTML and CSS reference below the video. For now, let's go back into general.css and let's get rid of this practice style that we were using. And now we're ready to move on. Next, we're going to learn about semantic elements. If we go back to our youtube.html file, so we learned about a bunch of elements like the div, the image, and the button. There's also another set of elements called semantic elements. So for example, header is a semantic element, and another example is the nav element. So these elements actually work the same way as a div, except they have a special meaning to screen readers, search engines, and any other kind of device or robot that is reading our web page. So to have the structure of our web page recognized correctly in a screen reader, we should actually replace some of our divs with semantic elements. So for example, we can remove this div and replace it with a header. So it works the same way as a div, except it's for the robots. So let's scroll down. We can turn this into a header. And then we can also scroll down to our sidebar, and we're going to change this to a nav element because the sidebar on the real YouTube should help us navigate through the website. Another semantic element we can use is called main. So this should contain the main contents of your website, which for us is this part. We're going to move everything inside here to the main element. So I think it's this. I might be missing. Okay, so move all of that into main. And let's scroll back up. Now inside main, we're gonna have a video grid, but we might also have other things below the video grid. So the video grid is known as a section of our main content. Let's save that and scroll all the way down to the end of our video grid and remove this with section. So that's how semantic elements work. They're just the same as divs, except they give a special meaning and structure to our page for search engines and screen readers. Now, the final thing I want to show you in this course is how to write comments. So comments are pieces of code that the computer ignores, but you can read yourself to remind you of information or to tell yourself what's going on in the code. So for example, if we scroll up to our header, maybe I forgot how we created this tooltip. So we can actually add a comment in the code that reminds us. So let's add a comment here. We're going to type less than exclamation dash dash. And we're going to end the comment with dash dash greater than, like this. So this is a comment. If I save the web page, you'll see that this text appears nowhere on the web page. And that's because the computer basically ignores comments. So we can add comments like put position absolute inside position relative to remind us that we need to put a position absolute inside a position relative to create this tooltip. In CSS, we also have comments. So for example, if we go here, we can write a comment by writing slash star and ending it with star slash. Now everything in between here is a comment. So we can say this style below will be inherited. So as you can see, comments add extra information into our code without affecting our web page. So it's a really useful tool when you're working on a team to document how your code works. And now for everything in this course, if you ever forget, remember that you can always Google it. For example, if I go to Google, I can search things like CSS rounded corners, and it will give us the border radius property. I can also search for something like CSS text don't wrap, and it will give us the white space property and the value white space no wrap. So this is how you learn from here. You take the techniques that we learned in this course, such as the nested layout technique, using grid, flexbox, and position, and then you try to recreate things that you see on the internet. And if you ever forget, you can Google and get the exact code that you need. So now that we learned all the major skills that we need to build complex websites like YouTube, here are some challenge exercises that you can do to create other popular websites on your own. Thanks so much for taking this course with me. I hope you now realize that creating websites is not as intimidating as it seems. We just need to create each part of the website step by step using the major features of HTML and CSS that we learned in this course. Now, where do we go from here? As the next step, I recommend learning the JavaScript programming language. JavaScript is what makes our web page interactive. For example, if we click something, type some text, or drag something onto the page, JavaScript is what updates our page. So it's a natural progression from HTML and CSS. Now, if you want to learn JavaScript, I have a full JavaScript course for absolute beginners that you can find by clicking this link. Again, thanks so much for watching. My name is Simon from supersimple.dev. I want to make a tech career possible for anyone. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please leave them down in the comment section below. If you want to support this channel and you want more courses like this, please click the subscribe button. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.